Your next speaker works at the global software consultancy ThoughtWorks, where she is currently the global lead for AI-assisted software delivery. She is a software developer, architect, and technical leader with about 20 years of experience in technology. Her long career in software delivery consulting has given her the opportunity to see many organizations and teams succeed and fail at delivering valuable software. The title of her talk, AI for Software Development, a Reality Check. Please welcome Birgitta Boeckeler.
Thanks. Yeah, hi everybody. So my name is Birgitta. I came here from Berlin, Germany, and as I was just introduced, I have had a role at my employer in this software consultancy for about almost a year now, I think. A role that was introduced to have one person just full-time focus on what AI, and of course, more specifically generative AI, means for the practice of software delivery. And it's intentionally, actually we call it for software delivery, to kind of include things beyond coding, and that's also actually what I want to talk about today. The edition didn't quite make it into the agenda. Like, I want to talk about tasks beyond coding, very specifically. And so in my role, I get to talk to lots of people in the company and connect dots between the different ideas they have, and I want to show you some of those today. So basically, as I said, it's kind of, how do we leverage AI for all of this, right? There have been a lot of talks at the conference about coding. How do we use coding assistants to code faster, to code better, to code worse? But I will look in this presentation specifically at the other knowledge-intense tasks that we have. And I will actually use a lot of requirements analysis as example, like user story writing and stuff like that. But the approach is actually applied to all kinds of tasks that we do in software that, are kind of knowledge intense. And just a quick disclaimer, I might be using the terms AI, Gen AI, and LLMs, so large language models, interchangeably in the presentation, as that's kind of like how people use it these days, right? When we say AI these days, it's often a shortcut for large language models. At least that's what I mean when I talk about it in this presentation. So why should we care as software delivery teams about large language models? It's because they are really good at text pattern matching and synthesis, and as such, they can give us applied assistance when we're executing tasks or when we're trying to solve a problem. So a few examples of what I mean by applied assistance. So let's say I'm a total beginner, I'm building my first web application, and somebody told me, oh, you should use Docker for that. But I have no idea what Docker is yet, so I can ask, I'm a beginner, what is Docker, and how does it apply to my particular case of building a web application? And then a large language model can actually answer me appropriately for my particular case and connect the dots between the theory of what Docker is and what it means in my particular situation. Another example, let's talk about coding after all, just very briefly. When I type a method signature or a comment into a coding assistant, then the coding assistant might, in this case, take like the theory of using list processing functions like map and group by and sum, and actually apply that to my problem. Or finally, an example from product management, product ideation. Let's say I say, okay, we are building EV charging stations and we expect more elderly users. What could happen? Give me pessimistic and bizarre scenarios. And it might tell me, you might have to be prepared for emergency call buttons to install them at your charging stations, or cyber threats might skyrocket with elderly people going digital, right? So I might not agree with all of those. I might not find all of those probable to actually occur, but it helps me with divergent thinking more out of the box. So we get this applied assistance, and then what we can get out of that, if we can use it if we can leverage it in a useful way, is learning, speed, and creativity. Creativity in ideation, and also maybe comprehensiveness in our planning. But there are a lot of kind of magical demos, and I'll show you some of those magical demos today as well. But it's, of course, not quite as easy as that, so I want to walk you through a few things that I think we need to really take advantage of this. And this is actually like a talk that looks more at now and maybe the next 1 or 2 years, right? So it looks at how can we use this today to support the way that we work today, right? There's of course also options to think about how can we do things totally differently in the future, right? But what do we need today to take advantage of this? So let's say I'm new in an organization or I'm new on a team and I get a message, welcome to the team, the PO is out sick, can you write the stories for this epic real quick about support for JDCF? And then the person goes dark on chat. So can I now just go to ChatGPT and do this, right? So, and I used a little animation here explicitly. I don't know if you can see the blinking cursor. So people talk about the empty page syndrome, right? But I think there's also this like blinking cursor syndrome, right? Like what do you type into this chat box, right? Because I'm new here, I have no idea how they write user stories in this company. Maybe they have like a specific way and level of detail, structure. I wonder what JDCF means. I actually made that acronym up for this example. And I don't know the application yet. So JDCF might be specific to this domain, this organization. So if I now go to ChatGPT and say, help me, this is the information I have, I actually put that into ChatGPT. It told me, sure, the JSON document computation format can be very useful. And I thought, oh, maybe I accidentally made something up that already exists, but it doesn't. Like, there's no JSON document computation format, so this wasn't very useful. But at the same time, it's actually quite good at giving me a basic framework of a user story. At least this would be useful if I was like fresh out of university and I've never written a user story before, right? So but what this shows is that we need to be able to express to the large language model, to the AI, what we need. And so we're in front of this blinking cursor with our skills and knowledge and experience. We have the training data of the model at our disposal as well. That was what we saw with the, this is what usually a user story looks like, but that's it, right? And usually when we work on these types of tasks, we kind of access all of these different things in the organization to try and figure out how to do this, right? We have the code bases to see how do things work today. We have wiki, issue tracker, service and API documentation. We can ask other experts or long-tenured people in the organization, company chat, and so on, right? So how can AI help us with this? And I'm going to walk through a little blueprint of what things I think we should consider when we're building AI assistants for a task. So it's going to go from like easy to do to more complex and more work to prepare. So I'll start with this example, breaking down an epic, right? And the first category I want to talk about is how we can codify practices and how we want to do them in shared prompts and share them with each other. And throughout, I will use examples a lot and little demos from a sandbox that we've built in ThoughtWorks for ourselves to try these things with our clients. So I just want to quickly introduce this first. So this UI, it's a very simple kind of like chat UI that you've probably seen in a lot of demos as well. So you have a choice of reusable prompts here at the top left. And one of them is, or two of them actually are about epic breakdown. Then when I choose one of them, I get a little bit of help. It describes to me what this does, and it tells me what type of input I need to provide to it. Then I provide some input to it. So this domain is actually about a customer relationship management system. So I want sales managers to plan their activities, visit clients, and so on. And then I get some output, some user stories, right? So we have the prompt instructions that codify the practice of breaking down an epic and how it's done in my organization, and my user input high-level description of the epic. So that's like our next part of the blueprint. The user has to provide some minimum input based on what I know at the time. So the prompt behind this example is actually relatively simple. It's like a simple, what's called like a one-shot prompt. I put input, I get a result. And if you would see the prompt, it's actually quite simplistic, because turns out large language models have a general idea of like how people in Agile write stories and break down epics. But of course, I could make this a lot more specific. I know there's like some people who like to not use UI, the mention of UI elements in their stories, for example, right? So it's like a particular practice of writing user stories. So you could make this more specific to how you want to do the practice. But let's look at a slightly more complex example maybe, and also it's an example that's maybe a bit closer to developers and architects. So let's look at threat modeling, which is a practice that is often quite daunting for people, right? It has to do with security, which is always a bit scary. You're supposed to do it, but you often kind of procrastinate it. And so the next part in the blueprint for this is to think about, when you're building AI assistants in the organization, which stakeholders and experts should I involve when I think about how to codify these instructions, right? So maybe there's a CISO, maybe there's some architects, security experts in the organization, and they say, I want teams to apply the STRIDE model when they do threat modeling. And some of you might know what that is, some of you might not. But you know, I could have this little tool in the organization that helps me understand what the STRIDE model is and apply it to my particular situation. So we have the first actually running demo here. So I'm providing some input here about my data flow in the application. And the tool is brainstorming examples for scenarios in each of the STRIDE categories. Which is, for example, the T stands for tampering with input, the I stands for information disclosure. So it's giving me examples of each of those categories for my particular situation. So how can you implement today this type of prompt sharing in the organization? One way is actually to use a coding assistant. So this is Continue. It's an open source coding assistant that has a feature where you can put in your repository a folder with a bunch of prompts and then turn them into custom commands in the chat of this coding assistant. It's actually a feature that two of my colleagues, Viviana and Catalina, recently contributed to as well to make it a bit more powerful. So we have our example here of the epic breakdown. I can choose it in the chat, and then I can provide the same input that I showed you before and get my results. So you could provide like a coding assistant like this to other members of your team as well, not only developers. The second way to do this is to use, I call it chatbot platform here. I don't think there's like a established term yet for these types of applications. So many of you might have used OpenAI's GPTs. That's like a similar thing. Then Diffie is a platform where you can also kind of define prompts and provide them to other people in your organization. Langsmith does something like that as well. And these tools also come with a lot more advanced testing and monitoring capabilities. So a lot more than what I was showing you in our little sandbox where we don't actually have that. But our sandbox, we actually also have published this code on GitHub if you want to have a look at it. So there we're kind of trying this idea of having like a knowledge pack. So we go to a client and we deploy it there for a team to experiment with this. And then they kind of develop their own knowledge pack to put their own prompts in addition to the ones that we bring. So secondly, I want to talk about different types of interactions for the user. So you just saw like the typical demos that you've probably seen a lot of times. That's just like a chat interface, right? But the question is that really the best way to assist all types of users and team members, right? And I think like a common misconception that makes some people maybe overestimate the impact this can have is of software delivery as this, oh, it's just a chain of artifacts, right? Epic, user stories, task lists, code, money, right? So and if only we could create the artifacts faster, then like everything would be better, right? But of course, it's not like that. Software delivery is a design process, and the journey is often a destination. And we still have to collaborate on these things a lot, right? It's not like an AI is just doing it by itself. So I'm much more interested in like how AI can assist us in this knowledge work, in thinking along. And for that, maybe a wall of text from a chatbot is not always what helps us think along, right? So let's look at the next example in our blueprint. So let's say, again, we have this user. We're considering our user in this AI assistance. And they say, oh, I don't have confidence that I know the scope well enough yet, right? So and I'm now showing like a different type of, slightly different type of interaction, where, again, in this case, I'm putting in like a high-level user story. And now the AI actually in a much more like structured way is asking me a bunch of questions. So it's kind of pretending to be a developer who's critiquing my story and asking me for like, oh, what about like length of the field, or like what else is here? Like what level of detail is required? Can people also edit and delete these activities when they create them, right? So I can actually overwrite the answers to these questions that the AI is assuming, and then click a button and say, generate a first version of a user story for me. And then probably I still have to do some manual work on it. But I recently talked to a colleague who has used not quite this interaction pattern, but something like with a similar goal and actually breaking down an epic. And he said that he felt much more confident in the next step going to the developers and having the discussions, because he felt like he had really looked at the whole kind of problem space and considered a lot of things beforehand. So there's potentially less back and forth and better flow on the team if you can have more comprehensive stories and thinking further to the left in the process. So this is kind of like a next component in our blueprint, also on the user input level, to think about the interaction patterns. So here we had kind of like a question and answer thing where the AI asked me questions. But it could also be that I'm like a very experienced person in terms of like requirements analysis, and I just want that one-shot prompt. I talked to a colleague a while ago who also used this question and answer thing in a chat mode, and she got really annoyed by it. And she has a lot of experience. So for her, she just wanted this prompt that gives her a lot of output, and she just goes, I need this, I don't need that, I need that, I add this thing, done. But she said that the question and answer pattern is potentially really useful for people that are, not as experienced yet. And, a lot of universities don't teach you how to write a user story yet, right? So for upskilling, she saw other interaction patterns as much more useful. So maybe like one little example there, going back to the threat modeling. So this is like a more guided version of that threat modeling. Doesn't ask you questions, but it gives you these different scenarios that we saw as a wall of text before. And then I can click on each of them and say explore. I can also show them in like a matrix that tells me what the AI thinks, what's probable and what has high impact. And then I can drill down and say, how can I prevent this, and kind of like continue my conversation. So it's kind of a combination of having like a more structured output that helps me more pick out what am I interested in, and then at the tail end kind of using more a chat interaction. So like just a few interaction variations, right? We had the one-shot prompt. You can also write prompts in a way that they kind of go step by step with you, and you can kind of interact in between. We had this Q&A pattern, giving more structured output, so I can more visually maybe choose between them, allowing images as input, or putting some form of like lightweight workflow on top of the system. So how do you do that today for software delivery tasks? I actually haven't seen that much out there, but it's a fire hose of information right now, right? So if any of you have seen something like this for a software delivery task, please let me know. So we're trying some things in this sandbox. As I said, the code is public on GitHub, so the discussion feature is also on. So if you have any ideas or feedback, then please let us know. So now let's go back to our user, right? So I think they, I have no idea how they write user stories in this company or how to write user stories, right? So with this kind of practice codification, we can kind of cover some of that, right? Let's say also, other people are in different time zones, and, so sometimes like pairing with an AI like that is actually useful. We kind of covered a little bit of this, like, I don't know the domain yet, because like all of the examples I showed so far of the customer relationship management domain is actually a relatively generic domain that the large language model is not so bad at covering. Like you can also imagine e-commerce. It's not, like shopping baskets and stuff like that. They're actually not that bad at that. But we actually have this in use at a team right now that has a much more complex and unusual domain. With a lot of acronyms and specific things, and then the model, of course, cannot cover that. And that's kind of this part of like, we still don't know what JDCF means, right? So, of course, the third part is how do we make more context available to the model that is relevant to all of these things that we have at our disposal usually as humans, and that we manually have to search for and put together. And again, I'm starting with a very simple approach. Again, we're involving an expert in the company or on the team who says, okay, here's a high-level description of the domain and the key domain terminology that we should be using in each prompt when we're doing something that's related to the domain. So in this case, I'm doing the thing, again, that I was doing before, but this time I'm actually pulling in such a snippet that was created before that does the basic domain descriptions, so it's not very sophisticated. But it's already helping us a little bit because this snippet is actually describing some of the cross-functional product requirements, like it needs to work offline first, and we need internationalization. So now when I'm breaking down this epic, I actually get reminded of those things, right? It's probably not 100% guarantee that the model will always remind us, but it's better than nothing, right? So this is like our first example of incorporating actually like a reusable piece of knowledge that gets pulled in as I'm doing this. And again, you can actually experiment with this with continue, as I was showing you before. So we had our epic custom command here, right? And now I also in my repository have a bunch of these snippets as files, and I can actually reference them here in the chat and pull them into my, my prompt when I'm describing my epic. And again, also in our sandbox, we're also allowing that in the knowledge pack that you put in the specific snippets. Like you can even do like multiple domains, right? And then the user can switch between the different contexts and say, now I'm working on the CRM application, and now I'm working on our authentication system, for example. And then it will pull in like different architecture descriptions or different tech stack descriptions or different domain descriptions. So when I went through this presentation about knowledge-intense task without mentioning RAG once, right? So I got very far, but now it's the time. So what we did so far is the user gives some input about what they want to break down. We have some prepared prompts. We enhance them with a static snippet, and we send that to the large language model. But of course, you can make that much more sophisticated. You can kind of connect to all of your different knowledge sources represented here at the bottom in the organization, like your wiki, your issue tracker, and so on, and or other resources, and kind of say what's relevant to this question, and pull that in dynamically and send that to the large language model. And that's what's, like in simple terms, what retrieval augmented generation is, right? RAG. So if you haven't heard of this yet, then I would say like for application developers who usually don't have to do much with AI, I would recommend that this is the one thing you look at. If you want to look at anything in the AI hype right now, you should have an understanding of what retrieval augmented generation is, because lots of applications are being built with it right now. So what does that look like? I'm actually going to like a slightly different example now because it's getting like a little bit more complex. So we have a team in ThoughtWorks that's working on a medical record system called Bamni that is open source. And they provided me a while ago with a 2,000-page export of their wiki. So we're going to try and use this PDF and pull it in as we're asking it to help us break down an epic or a user story, I don't quite remember right now, some requirements around editing allergies in the system. So when a doctor is editing allergy information for a patient. So we're saying, yeah, user story refinement, putting that in. We're getting a first like context and goal of this, and then I'm pulling in this wiki. And it's telling me like which pages of the PDF it thinks it found some relevant information. And I actually asked it like, what else should I keep in mind when changing the requirements for managing patient information? And it's pulling in this information. I actually showed this to my colleagues who are working on this, and they said, in this particular story, I actually copied and pasted this story from their Jira. It wouldn't have been that relevant, right? So this is like a very simple example that just like to illustrate like how can this work in theory, right? So that we can have a public example here. And I was talking before about the team that is using this in a like much more complex domain, and they've done a similar thing. They've taken part of their wiki, exported it, and pulled it in here, and they found that it's actually quite useful for them when they're working on stories to kind of pull in additional information. So we have like a more advanced form of pulling in our knowledge here. But what about the most accurate documentation we have, which is the code, the only thing that actually represents what's happening in our system, right? I don't have a demo for that, but I just briefly wanted to talk about one approach that we're trying with some clients that looks quite promising. And there are, of course, many new products right now that are trying to do similar things, like trying to see how can we get relevant parts of the code base when we ask questions and actually answer questions about the code base, right? But like one approach that a lot of people are trying is to take the code and have like some logic that takes not only the code, but also takes advantage of like code analysis tools or additional documentation and puts all of that into a knowledge graph. So for example, we've tried that with COBOL code bases, right? Where you have kind of like dependencies between the different programs. You pull in some documentation. You use like an actual COBOL analysis tool to put this together, and then you do RAG. You do retrieval augmented generation on top of that. So I would then maybe be able to ask, what are the fields displayed in the fictional JDCF viewer screen? What validations are done when processing those records? I would imagine like if you have a team assistant like that where you actually want to write user stories to change something existing, right? It could be quite useful to have access to the code base with natural language questions to get some additional context. So basically, I walked through this blueprint, right? Like we codify our instructions in a prompt. We should always think about the user, what types of users we want to support. Is it like newbies? Is it very experienced people? Do we want them to learn? Do we just want them to get faster? What input can we expect from them? What would they know? What type of interaction pattern makes sense? So you might actually have 3 or 4 different ways to support or assist in writing a user story. What knowledge makes sense for this particular task that should be pulled in, and what stakeholders and experts should I involve, because they might have an interest in how we do this task, or they might have a really good idea how to do it. But of course, when you look at that, the next question is, okay, if we can do a retrieval augmented generation, can we just turn on the fire hose then, right? Can we just connect Confluence, Jira, maybe we're already using Backstage or a developer portal like that with lots of information about our systems, all of the code bases, and then we'll have all the context there, right? My only AI-generated image in the presentation, by the way, so I'll let you look at it. And we might be quite close to actually being able to try that out, because Atlassian has started announcing first features that kind of go in that direction. And for a lot of us, a lot of our knowledge in an organization is in Jira and is in Confluence, right? So these are some screenshots from a video by Atlassian where they recently showed some of these features. It's maybe a bit small and black, but I'll tell you what it is. So on the left there, it kind of shows like related resources that they're pulling in automatically based on what's in the issue already. So they're trying to determine which Confluence pages would be relevant to this and attaching it to the issue, so that when you then say, okay, help me make this more specific or break it down, it also takes that into account. And then on the right, it shows integration into coding assistants that they announced, where you can say in the coding assistant chat at Atlassian, and ask a question, and then it starts trying to determine which Jira issues are relevant, pulling in that information and trying to answer your question. Or I think in the demo it also looked as if it was automatically trying to determine which issue you're assigned to and kind of giving that more importance when it was answering the question. I do think, though, while I'm excited to try this out, and it would be great if it like works really well, opening the fire hose, I mean, I do think that curation will still matter to an extent. So if you think about your wiki and all the things that are in there, right, is that information that you want to amplify with AI, right, in all the places. So there's fuzzy and changing terminology, right? Like domain terms change meaning over time, or the same term might mean different things in different bounded contexts, and you use it in different ways, or 2 different terms meaning the same thing, and so on. And then often our documentation is outdated or plain wrong. There's also a problem of access control, which of course companies like Atlassian can take care for us, right? If we just open the fire hose, we still have to make sure that people only get the information that they actually have access to. And also an open question is if it will just be too much, right? Even if the context windows of the models are increasing, if we're throwing more and more context at them in a prompt, will they actually be able to deal with it, or will it be too unspecific? And I've also had like some experiences like working in a code base, trying to get a coding assistant to answer some questions for me about the current state of the code. And it was answering the questions based on documentation that I had committed to the repository, but that documentation was outdated. So there's like all of these little nuances about like how can you get the model to be more useful than distracting if you throw too much at it, right? So I talked about why we should care, this applied assistance, right? So I think this like looking for information, purely looking for information is maybe not the right use case for this, right? To help us learn, get faster and more creative and comprehensive. But we need some things to make that worthwhile, right? And one of those things large language models also help us with. It's this like more powerful search over unstructured data through these retrieval augmented generation approaches, right? So there's a lot of just like search technology involved in RAG as well. But large language models with their abilities to generate embeddings have definitely given this like a huge boost up to give us like a whole new form of search there. But I think we need to combine it with like very thought through context orchestration and knowledge curation as well, which is like a bit more manual and you need experts, right? And we need to think about the user experience for the human in the loop. If we really want this to be assistance in knowledge work, in design work, then we have to think about like how can the user best process this information and quickly move it around and actually turn it into something that makes sense for them. And with great power comes great responsibility. As I said, we have to think about what we want to amplify, because generative AI will amplify indiscriminately. It doesn't know what's good information, what's bad information. It only sees the tokens, right? So we need to think about what we put in there and how we do this context orchestration in a way that there's like a little bit of awareness, at least, of what's outdated, what's correct, and so on. So the cool thing, though, is that we're kind of all sharing a domain with each other, which is the craft, right? Which is our practices, the domain of software delivery. So I've been wondering, is there like a way at some point where we'll have these kind of blueprints, right, for all of our different tasks, for like threat modeling, critiquing an architecture decision record, brainstorming fitness functions. I mean, I talked a lot about user story writing, epic breakdown, design thinking practices, all of those things, right? So could we have like at some point a catalog as like a profession of like these kind of like task supports and what type of knowledge makes sense to feed into this, and then you have your own knowledge pack or whatever you want to call it, and you kind of like plug it into those blueprints, so you don't have to like think through all of those parts over and over again, because we're all using very similar practices. And also, how will that shape the way that we think about documentation, and documentation that can be used for these blueprints, right? And maybe even documentation that we haven't, that we never created before because we didn't have this particular use case to make it even more useful. And I want to end with two quotes that I use all the time at the moment by Ethan Mollick. The first one is, AI is terrible software. And what he means by that is, he thinks we should anthropomorphize AI because it doesn't work like software that we usually use. So we all have to make this mindset shift when we use this and when we think about what we want to use it for, that this does not work like the other software that we use to find the right use cases for this. So, and this is kind of like the final component of this. Like, we can throw structure and concepts and blueprints at this thing, and then but you know, if we as the users don't make this mindset shift of that we still need to be the human in the loop and improve this, then that doesn't matter, right? And so Ethan Mollick says working with AI is easiest if you think of it like an alien rather than a human-built machine. And I find that quite useful. And finally, I just want to give a shout out, even though most of you may not know them, to my colleagues Farouk Ali and Zhu Hao in particular. As I said, I work with a lot of people in the company and try to connect the dots, and they did a lot of like interesting thinking already last year about, you know, beyond chat user experience, and I still haven't seen a lot of that out there, what Farouk has done. And then Zhu Hao is like a really good sparringspartner for AI as an amplifier of knowledge. And then finally, you know, check out our our sandbox and give us some feedback or ideas if you want to in the discussion section. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for your talk. Would you like to answer a couple of questions?
Sure.
Super. We have 2 so far, and more will be coming in. So Henrik showed an image input with cursor.sh yesterday. What are your thoughts on using wireframes and diagrams rather than user stories? Jason would like to know.
Yeah. I mean, you can pass in wireframes and diagrams not only as images, you can also use diagrams as code software, right? Like we've actually seen that the models are often not that bad at actually parsing through them as well. But we also have a thing in our sandbox where we also allow people to upload an image. So for example, a user journey flow, right? And then say, okay, what are the features in this? Help me, instead of me typing this out, help me break this down into stories, or upload an architecture diagram, and then use the description as part of your input and say, okay, maybe I'm the product manager. I don't want to annoy all my developers with what this actually is. Like, explain this to me like a 5-year-old, or you know, as an architect, I could say, can you tell me some weak points of this architecture? Maybe I dismiss 3 of them right out of the gate because they don't make sense, but it might give me new ideas, right? I've definitely found that the image description is even more hit and miss than the text interaction. So, you know, it also depends on how your image is built. So if it mixes like a lot of different things and concerns in a diagram, which we often do in our diagrams, right, it also gets confused. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing that we're also trying out. Thank you.
And Silvio asks, what is the most impactful area where we can apply Gen AI to enhance software development?
Yeah, I would definitely still think it's coding. Like, yeah, and it's definitely the one that works the best so far and where there's like the most experience. Like, I think over 50 of our clients at this point are using coding assistants, including big enterprises like Mercedes-Benz. And while there's still like a lot of risks and like unintended consequences that we might not even know yet, I think they're here to stay, and we, as a profession, should figure out like how this changes our practices and how we can use them in a responsible way. So I still think it's also the thing that we do the most on a software delivery team, right? So I think it has the most impact.
Thank you very much. We have a lovely gift here for you I'd like to present to you. And let's give one more round of applause for Birgitta Boeckeler. Thank you very much.
Thanks.